Our place is Mulderry, and it's probably, it's not probably, it's 18 kilometres out of Rylstone. And that was such a great spot, because the drive home, it used to take us about 25 minutes to drive from the high school at Kandos to home. And that 25-minute drive through the beautiful scenery, that was your unwind, debrief time. And by the time you got home, any stresses from the day had just totally disappeared. Lovely part of the country.
Can I add, adding on to that, we had initially bought a small acreage down on the Turon River. So we used to escape down to the Turon when we lived in town of a Friday night and come back of a Sunday night. So our kids had the freedom to roam, and so I think that was another reason that we bought out of town, because of the freedom.
Living in a sort of an out of a town environment in that isolated sort of area, how did the drought affect your lives at that time?
Well, if we start back, we had bought Mulderry in 2000. We had made a decision right at the word go that the property would be somewhere to live on. It would not be farmed per se. So we had no intentions of trying to farm it. One of the other things we did back then was we put down a bore through into this, and we were lucky to get through the sandstone filtered water. So we had an abundant water supply, which carried us all the way through. Like 2002 was a drought. 2019 there was a couple more in between. So from a drought perspective, we were doing okay, because we had a good water supply. We weren't reliant upon tank water. Where it really made a difference was, I've always been a real keen gardener right throughout the whole time, and you could really notice that it didn't matter how much water you put on the vegetables, they just weren't flowering, they weren't setting. And so the abundance that we had always had of our fresh fruit and veggies really became less and less. And that was a real significant thing that we saw in 2019. One of the other aspects that came in 2019 was that I had a significant run-in with cancer in the second half of the year. And I still remember the oncologist saying that the cancer that I had, they had one chance to get it, otherwise I'd be dead in 2 years. So that was a fairly confronting statement, and it was basically anything that they needed, we just did. So it was testing, and then it was surgery, and then it was the radiation treatment. So that almost, you could say that actually took a little bit of precedence over the actual effects of the drought. While I was having the treatment, we had our motorhome set up down in one of the suburbs of Sydney, down Vineland, and so every Sunday night we would drive down to there so we could go to Westmead and do our have the treatment throughout the week, and then we'd drive back home on the Friday night. And this is where we just spent, 6 weeks backwards and forwards, and that was an interesting time.
To add to the question about how the drought affected, I suppose, what it does, it plays with your head and your mind, because throughout the drought, even though there was very little rain, you often got a lot of lightning storms and things like that. And as a consequence, you were always on tenterhooks, hoping that, because we have various lightning strikes around the property over the time, and you were always hoping that a lightning strike didn't start a fire, because you knew it would just, run and go really fast, because there'd been a number over the last, previous to that, over the last, say, 5 years.
It was in October, so it would have been in the middle of all of your, having treatments and all the things that were going on in your life, managing the drought, the whole thing, and the water situation. But, there was a lightning strike up near the old Gospers airstrip, in the Wollamai National Park, and at what point did it start to become a threat to you or become a concern? Is it the part of the mega fire that affected your area, or was it?
Ultimately, the fire that affected us was the one that was called the Kerry's Ridge fire, which is another lightning strike. It started a bit later than Gospers, and I remember Lyn driving me up to the top of Nullo Mountain so we could have a look, because the Kerry's Ridge fire was over to the east of Nullo Mountain. And in all my experience, I said, no, look, it will keep on going. It'll go towards the east, because that's what invariably happens. The fires, it's always a westerly. Well, just to prove me wrong and prove a lot of people wrong, I think it proved everybody wrong. It decided that it would keep on, the easterly winds just kept on pushing it back to the west. There was, to me, there was something like a draw factor between the huge Gospers fire and this one, and they came together. So now you had a fire which was as well as heading towards the Sydney problem, which is where all the media was. It was coming to the west, and it had these hundreds of kilometres of fire front, and there were communities and there were properties in the road of that fire, and it was just rolling through. And unfortunately, our place, Mulderry, was one of the properties that was in the line of that fire.
David, you said what was, I suppose, the deciding factor to a degree, and I think the deciding factor that made us really, really think that our place would get burned was the fact that on the weekend before, so it was probably about the 11th or something like that, the local fire captain from Melinda came around and said, we're going to put a grader line around your house. And I suppose that made it real.
It really did. That was going on with that there, like when we put that grader line around the house, that was the realism, because up until then I'd kept on saying to myself, and I suppose it was all in our minds, that no, it's not going to come over here, it will stop, they will stop it on the Linda Nullo Mountain Road, this type of thing. And that was fairly confronting when he said, look, we need to put a line around it. And I understood that, but it's always doing it on somebody else's place, and this was on our place. So going on from that, the realism of it, we had the grader putting its line right around the house and the shed area. With that, Lyn said, right, let's start looking at moving our memories and our treasures out. So we actually came over here to Mudgee, hired a storage unit, and so then we started bringing over, firstly it was I suppose, the memories and treasures, and then we sort of think, well, and we just kept on bringing carloads and carloads of, we unpacked the house basically and brought it over here into the storage, because that was the realism. That was where it was really starting to hit home, I suppose, that it could actually get us, right?
We were also, I suppose, lucky in that we had a motorhome that we'd bought last year to travel. I'd retired the end of the year before, so we thought we'd do some travelling. Well, it didn't see a lot of travelling, but it was incredibly valuable for 6 weeks down in Sydney for Bryan's radiation. And so we then moved that into the caravan park in Rylstone, so that if we had to evacuate, we had somewhere to go. And so I suppose I always, and I think probably both of us, you respond better when you know you've got a bit of a plan. And they always push, have you got a bushfire plan and things like this. And it's a bit nebulous until you're actually faced with the whole thing. I mean, we'd always planned to evacuate because I knew I couldn't stay, and at that stage Bryan wasn't very well from his radiation, and so he couldn't stay and fight the fire, so we'd planned to leave. So, those little things, I suppose, also help you get through to a degree, because you've got some backup like that.
And one more thing that I would add in onto that was a group of friends from the high school came out on the Thursday. So this was the Saturday we'd had the grader, and then the Monday we started moving, and then they came out on the Thursday. and and also Josh and Sasha had come up on the Wednesday. So all of a sudden we had this group of people who came, and the whole thing was support. And so what they did, I suppose the mantra became, bare ground doesn't burn, and they just cleared through. Hooter brought his tractor in. It's amazing how much they cleared through, just expanding on the whole thing of putting a protective barrier around our place, both the house and the shed. And when we were talking about it, we'd said, if the fire is close, we are just going to leave. The house is going to have to stand on the preparation we can put into it. We're just going to leave. And anyhow, so the working bee was great on the Thursday. Everything had sort of calmed down. We'd just had dinner, and that was when we got an emergency phone call, the emergency warnings, saying the fire was 2 k's away from us. It had spotted to that. We should leave. And so Lyn had got that phone call. She'd no sooner hung up than the FCO2 rang to say exactly the same thing. You said it would get, if it was at 2 kilometres, you'd go. It's 2 kilometres, you should be going. So we were packed and ready, and I suppose in 10 minutes, our convoy of cars were heading out the gate. In actual fact, we nearly ran over the poor chap from the National Parks and Wildlife who had come to warn us, to saying to people, you should evacuate. And we said, mate, we're on our way, we're out of here. Luckily, and that was when it was, from our point of view, we were so lucky that we had the motorhome in at the caravan park, that we actually had somewhere to go to. That was a plan. And like that warning hit every one of the properties, and I've just never seen so many tail lights going down Cox's Creek Road as there was that evening. And then coming back against us were the fire trucks and the fire crews. And so, it was,
I suppose the thing that hit both Sasha's, our son's partner, and I, was the fact that we had to grab our Christmas presents, so we're all out around the fire. And it's just really funny, but you grab those things, and I know Sash raided the fridge and took chocolate and all that sort of stuff, and it's those little things that you think about, well, why did you do that? But I don't know why you did it, but you did it. And it was, they're the sorts of things, and I suppose, and everyone watched the fires near me app like you're like an eagle on this app all of the time, and the poor people couldn't keep it up to date. There was so much information coming in, and so you were continually relying upon that tiny little thing to allow you to know whether you had a place or not, and it was a pretty traumatic sort of a time, but
you had quite an amazing plan, though. That was good.
Maybe that's just our school teacher background.
Could be.
I don't know, but there was, it was. I suppose I was a little amazed. Other people hadn't thought that it would ever come, and that reality didn't hit them. And maybe that was because we'd had more to do with the RFS, and we knew once you start to put grader lines around, it's a fairly serious thing. And I don't know. So, I think there's a lot that came out. Now you look back and you think of that time, and you think, if it ever happened again, and I'm hopefully it never ever does, but it will happen somewhere. And I think knowing what we went through and how things developed, there's a lot of practices that need to be put into place to be able to allow the community, not just us, to allow the community to feel safe. Like people just next door, and I hadn't thought about it till later, they evacuated, or the woman evacuated, but she had nowhere to go. She didn't know where to go, so she slept in a car in the showgrounds. And you think, well, there's a million people in Rylstone who would have said, come here, but it wasn't a plan. And I think that's part of the plan that's now got to be developed. You don't ask, you're very loath to go and ask somebody, but if someone came and grabbed you, you'd just go. So I think there's a lot to be learned from the way it went. Yeah,
for sure. Because Bryan, during that time, you've had a long association with the RFS. how was it for you being in this situation? Like you said, it all became very real, and you knew what the different steps and the different actions were that meant that it was getting close.
That to me was one of the hardest of the decisions, I suppose. That I knew health-wise I was still very fragile, and so I couldn't actually put a uniform on and go and fight the fires or thing. And so you look at it and you think, there's all that experience I've got, and yet at the moment I can't do a bloody thing with it, which was the shame. Yeah. So I didn't actually, I didn't go in the uniform, but as I was improving, I was getting better, and so therefore I was able to go as, I suppose, the community member, Bryan the farmer, Bryan the community person, in to start helping on the fire, and that really started to make a difference actually, and I think that really had an effect. I suppose where it really started to kick in was on, like Josh and I had gone out after we'd evacuated there on the Thursday night. We'd gone out the Friday or the Saturday, and on the Sunday the fire was actually on Mulderry. It was actually on our property, and even though we had said all the way through that the preparations that we do will have to suffice, the place will have to stand or fall basically on the preparations that we've done. When you actually saw the fire on that place, you really couldn't. And I remember I just looked at Josh and we said, yep. And I rang Lyn to say, look, the fire's here, we're going to have to fight it. And I remember Lyn saying, be careful. And and then I rang a friend, young herder Reynolds, and he said, I'm on my way, and him and his son turned up with their utes and fire tanks and this sort of thing. And so we were then, and it was a case of, you couldn't, because of the size of the fire, you couldn't actually attack it, but it was a case of, okay, prepare to protect it when it comes to your fire break. That's when you've got to sort out. So we were prepared on that, and then through the afternoon, some RFS units came in, and they had the okay to it. They couldn't actually actively light fire, but they could promote it along the fire break, and so that spent a fair bit of time through the afternoon. And then the gully at the back of the shed was ribbon gums and manna gums, the sort of massive candle bark trees which just set up, and getting the fire through there was absolutely it was a bit frantic. And anyhow, we got it past there and up into the timber chains, up into the scribbly gums, and so they didn't have that chance for spotting into the unburnt. And by that stage, it was the crews that were there, the RFS crews, they had to stand down. It was the end of their shift, and we thought some other crews might came back, but a little bit later we realised that there was nobody else coming apart from the ones that were on the ground there with us. So there was Josh and Huda and young Ty and myself. And so we worked the fire then around the greater line and up, so that it was between the house and the wildfire that was still coming in. And and that was pretty interesting. But we got it there, and then we were patrolling and just keeping it. And we thought, this was about 11 o'clock, and I remember the boys saying, Jesus, you're looking bloody, a bit like death warmed up, Dad. Josh said, why don't you go and have a sleep, and all this sort of thing. And it was sort of up and down a bit, but anyhow, so I went and had a kip, and I said, look, I'll wake up at about 3, and I'll set the alarm. And I got up at 3, and I looked outside, and the whole of the eastern sky was just glowing. And I'm thinking, what the bloody hell's happened? And anyhow, called Josh on the 2A, and he said, it's all right, Dad, it's all right, I'll come down. So anyhow, he came down and picked me up, and And what had happened, there'd been the RFS had a big strike team, and they'd bought the fire break and they'd marched it down the road, down Cox's Creek Road. 4.5 kilometres they came down, and then down along our power line and joined up with our fire break that we had established there early in the night. And so that's why the whole sky was glowing. They had burnt out this whole area just to stop the fire. And at that stage we thought, bloody fantastic, and it was good. So they then went off home, and so our patrolling then sort of just took on a bigger image, I suppose. We went over a bigger distance, but you know, everything was pretty calm and it was good, and yeah, that was an interesting night. It was a full-on night.
Amazing. It was a very emotional experience for all of us as well, but we often shared a meal with you and Kaylee the dog, and yeah, it was quite a time to look at that map that they used to put up on the wall and where that line was moving every day and how fast it was travelling, and that was quite exceptional.
It's actually pretty horrible not knowing what's going on at your home, because where we were positioned, we used to look out and the sky was pretty black and brown and horrible, and you could just see the wind. The wind was horrendous most of the time, and so I suppose that actually provided for me a stability to a degree, that I could come down and there was people, you know, that you knew would support you, and if you felt sad, they'd look after you and that sort of stuff. But it also allowed me to make contact with the firefighters when they came in, because I knew a lot of them, and so they'd tell you where things were up to as well. So it was a bit of an update, but it was more that you knew they were going through a pretty horrible time out there. I talked to a lot of them, and the conditions on that Thursday night when the fire first came through were just horrendous. Some of those guys didn't think they'd ever get back from Nullo Mountain that night. And when the fireball came across Cox's Creek Road, you know, they put up with some awful conditions there. And so to be down there with Rotary gave you that feeling of camaraderie, but a family. And that was really special.
That's good.
And yeah, so it allowed me to get through, because one of the things I found with the fires, they terrified me. And I've always been a very strong person. I don't give in to too much. And the fires just turned me to jelly, and I couldn't be there. And like I went out on the night, the boys, when it came up behind the shed, and I couldn't go within 50 metres. I couldn't go down and see the boys or anything like that, because I was just terrified. And so whenever I saw these flames and the glow and all that sort of stuff, I just had to go. I just couldn't be there. And so it was really good that Rotary, you know, were there to provide that support for me as well.
It was a good experience for us as well. So Bryan, I suppose on the upside of it, when this had all calmed down and everything, what was the place like? What was your property like?
Well, see, this was, you've got to understand that the fire came at us twice. So this was the 22nd of December 2019. That was the eastern fire, and then the fire, as fires do in their own good time, went off down, I suppose you'd be saying to the north of us, went down probably quite a few kilometres, not exact, and then jumped over a fire break down there. And so then it was able to sweep up along the western side of Cox's Creek Road and Cox's Creek. And so by now you're starting to talk towards New Year, and on New Year's Day it had burnt right past our place. The Bulga Hills had burnt. It was keeping on coming. It was heading towards Rylstone, if you like, heading down. And then, of course, New Year's Day, we ended up with a massive westerly, big temperatures, and it just blew it straight across the road. Now we had probably 10% of our property, so of the 300 acres, between the road and the power line that hadn't burnt, and the fire just spotted across the road like it was nothing. And when it got into that area, it burnt that out, but it burnt probably, you'd say it would have run 2 kilometres and damn near it only seemed like about 10 minutes. And the vegetation that it's burnt through there massively, the damage is immense. The big trees that are there have just died because the fire was so hot. It was just intense. And so, if you can think yourself lucky, we got a fire on the 22nd of December and then another fire on the 1st of January. So that was what we had to come back to, that one of the reasons that we had gone out there was that you had the different colours of the eucalypts and the different greys. So you had the greens and the greys out there. And when we went back after the fires, it was just all black. The noise of the bush. So your bird life, your wildlife, it was just gone. It was, if you had a measure, if we had 10% now of what we had before, that would be lucky. The number of the macropods, say your roos and that, are absolutely minimal. Like where before you would see, it was nothing to see 20, 30, 50 in a mob. Now you might see one, or you won't see any in that area. And that's the sort of destruction that happened. It was I suppose a twofold thing. It was a drought and the fires. When we talked about, we were talking earlier, David, about the cockatoos. Now, every year we've been there, and probably a hell of a lot of years before we came, there was this huge viminalis, big manigum down at the front of our place near the dam. And it was the roosting place and the nesting place for white cockatoos. There was a pair of white cockatoos, came there every year, obviously laid their eggs, did their thing, and raised 3-4 young birds. And those little cockatoos were just able to fly when the fire came through on the 1st of January. And that big tree, which had been there for, it was hundreds and hundreds of years old. And the fire just went up it and then started to burn in every one of those hollows. And I have a photo of it, and it's just glowing like it's just onto the dark. And the holes up in the branches, the big branch holes, are just glowing like rubies, And then nearly, I suppose it would have only been 5 minutes after I took that photo, and the crown crashed out of that tree. And it was that sort of thing that you saw all the way through, the massive, that was destruction. The good thing, of course, was that those little cockatoos had managed to fly, and even though their flight was the dodgiest, they were so unco, but they flew into the small area around the house where we still had trees and that hadn't burnt, and that's where they then grew up. So that was, what are some of the things we remember? The blackness, I suppose, and those young cockatoos.
Yeah, and what you just said then is so correct. It's that silence that from the Australian bush that isn't normally there, and that was something that really sits in my mind. I didn't hear the explosions of the fires or anything like that while that was happening, except from a great distance. But that silence afterward was incredible.